Hello, everybody. This is Tandy, and you are listening to the Beer Ladies podcast once again. Thank you for joining us. We have got the full crew today. So season 3, if you hadn't quite figured it out yet, is just the 4 of us, which is kind of exciting. So we've got Katie, Lisa, Christina, and myself. And it's not because we didn't like our season 2 hosts, folks. It's because everybody gets busy and not everybody can commit to a full season of Beer Ladies hosting and recording. So fair play to everybody, and thanks again to the season 2 hosts. So it's the 4 of us today, and we've got a topic that is close to my heart. It is all about home brewing. As you know, I'd like to say an avid home brewer, but I haven't brewed the whole of summer. So that's, I'm going to be one of these like lapsed home brewers at some stage, but we're going to talk homebrewing today. We're going to go through a couple of things gone right, things gone wrong, how to get started in homebrewing, and what we might even look for with beer judging. So what to do when you're entering a homebrew competition to give yourself the best advantage. But before we get into all of that, let me remind you of all of our usual admin-y things. We have a link tree now on our socials. That is Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We are at Beer Ladies Pod everywhere. Facebook, I think, is Beer Ladies Podcast, but we are on Beer Ladies Pod on Instagram and Twitter. And from there, you can find different ways to either share our episodes or support us as a collective, as a group of women talking about beer. So you could buy some merch at our merch store, or you can buy us a beer or a coffee, whatever. And all of those links are in our bios, in our link tree, and they're also in the show notes down below. So go on, head to those, and anything is always appreciated. So that's it, guys. Socials, the best way to really support us, besides things like buying merch or buying us a beer, is to share this podcast with your friends. Share your favorite episode, or just share the whole thing. Share a whole Spotify link if you wanted. But we're on all the podcatchers as well as on YouTube. Okay, let's go around the houses. Let's see what we're drinking. We're going to skip Christina today because she's not drinking today, which is also fair play. So Katie, let's go to you.
So I am drinking a Leaf Kicker 2022 from Kinnegar. Woohoo! There we go.
I had one of those yesterday.
Ah, do you? It's a Märzen. It's a special. It's not one of their Brewers in Play series though. So I'm wondering, is it going to be, I don't know, an annual thing? I don't know. Tell us. This is what it looks like. Really nice, kind of goldeny color, and it tastes delicious as always from Kinnegar. But yeah, I went to I was in McHugh's in Malahide Road, and all the Oktoberfest stuff was in, and I was just like, I have to buy this. I was like a kid in a sweet shop, you know. So there we go. That's what I'm drinking.
Stunning. Lisa, what have you got today?
Oh, well, first of all, I'm very excited to be back for this season, and it's been crazy the past couple of weeks. And so partially because it's been a crazy past couple of weeks, I'm on low key today. So I'm on the Wicklow Wolf Moonlight. That's their non-alcoholic hoppy ale. I was going to say, is it hoppy pale ale? Just hoppy ale. But it's quite a golden color. So, but definitely it's got good flavor to it. I know. Quite often some of the non-alcoholic beers that are maybe not as successful have a bit of a wort flavor to them, which we'll probably talk about since home brewing, but this does not have that character at all. It's very pleasant. So good school night option. So Wicklow Wolf with their non-alcoholic one.
Very nice. So I've got a homebrew tonight, although it is not my own, and that's my confession. As I told you, I haven't brewed the whole of summer. This is a Barleywine, and it's 11.7%, and it is from a brewer that I regularly swap brews with. His name is Matt de Brewer on Instagram, and he is a phenomenal brewer. I even cracked out a special crystal glass for this one, which is quite fun.
Fancy.
Yes, and I said, I think it's actually a Waterford crystal, so that's kind of cool, even though it traveled from South Africa. So, but this is diametrically opposite to what Lisa's drinking, because it is
very much
11.7%. That being said, the weather's good for it, and it's got all the warming flavors that you want from a barley wine, and it's beautiful. It's rich and layered, and doesn't have a lot of head, but that's not atypical for barley wines. It's gorgeous. Thoroughly enjoying this sipper at the moment.
Lovely.
Alrighty. So, friends, who around the table has homebrewed? Show of hands and show of voices.
Oh, it looks
All
like
of
everyone.
us.
Yay.
Full house. That's
My
amazing.
hand is very low because I
Tell
haven't
us
done
about
it.
it, Katie.
I've homebrewed 3 times. And the first time was when somebody was kind of teaching me how to do it. The second time I did it by myself and thought it was great. And it turned out really well, actually. So then the third time I'm like, come on, friends, I'll show you all how to brew. And obviously got hammered while we were brewing and didn't clean something and it had to be poured down the drain. And I haven't done it since because, I don't know, stuff just gets in the way, doesn't it? It's all the stuff is still upstairs in the attic, but there we go.
Fair enough. I feel like you're not a real home brewer unless you've had to pour something down the drain at some point in your adventure, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Lisa, how often do you brew these days and what do you like to brew?
It's again, I feel like same. We haven't done much this summer, although I feel like maybe we're all allowed because it was so hot and putting on my beer judge hat, you know, think of how often that the temperature makes things go wrong. So I feel like we all get a bit of a pass for not brewing much this summer, but we did have a couple of things that we were doing in the spring, and we've got kind of a long-term project in the mead we've got bubbling away under our staircase. So that is one where that's going to be a very long, sort of long tail project there. And we keep sort of putting different things in it. Like we've done Szechuan peppercorns, we've done different fruits, all kinds of different things. So that one's almost an easy, it was almost an easy sort of tick box because it's already there. We can just put different things in it and it makes it a very different, different kind of a thing. But I do think it's getting to be that time of year where, you know, I'm looking around, I'm not seeing enough bitters or milds out there. So it might be time to correct that at home. So watch this space.
Mm-hmm. And Christina, friend, I think for anybody that follows Christina on Twitter or anywhere else, we all know that Christina tends to brew all these really ancient medieval ales. Tell us more about that.
Right. So the reason I do this is because it's a lovely loophole that I don't have to do all that sanitizing that you have to do when you normally brew. So basically, the moral of the story is I'm lazy. So I make these things, and then I also get to do, if it gets infected, oh, well, that's just part of the historical process. So really, it's just a loophole.
We've all got them. It's all good.
Love it. Now, I started brewing initially, and I think what you'll find is a lot of people start this way. I started brewing with kits. So a kit is just it's like a tin, and it's got this really rich sort of syrup in it. And what it is, it's the what's the word I'm looking for? The concentrated wort. So imagine when you've put a whole bunch of grains into water, that's the first step called mashing. All of your grains get in there and it's almost like making a porridge. Now, what they do with that is once it's reached its final, well, it's gravity, which means it's reduced, they've taken out all the sugars. They take this and they boil it right down so that what you're left with is a syrup. And all you have to do to brew with a kit is that you take this syrup, you add it to a bunch of water, and then you add effectively the yeast. So it's already got hops in a lot of cases, and there are different ways you can do it. But all you're doing is adding syrup to water, adding yeast, you let it ferment, and then you come back a couple of weeks later and bottle it, and Bob's your uncle, you have beer. So I did that twice. The first one was an IPA, and I was hell of a worried about how it was going to turn out. And actually at the time, I didn't like IPAs that much. And I think that this homebrew was one of the steps that made me like IPAs more, which is weird and not at all arrogant, because I'm sure it was absolute rubbish. I was probably just, you know, what is that attachment that you get to things that you make yourself? Yeah, there's a name for that one. So I think that that's what happened there. So I did 2 kits, and then immediately I was like, screw this, you can't control it enough, you can't be creative enough. So I convinced my husband to get us a grain father, which is the very opposite end of the spectrum of home brewing, and it's where you have a fully fledged piece of kit and you get your own grains and your own hops, and you can do all of the recipes and measurements yourself. And that's how I've been brewing ever since, which is good fun. Not to say that I'm always a very successful home brewer. So, you know, like Katie, I've definitely poured 1 or 2 down the drain. funny enough, never really for sanitation, which we'll touch on because sanitation is a really big step. But often just because I'm way too lazy is maybe the right word, or maybe arrogant, or maybe ADHD. Who knows? I can't follow a recipe to save my life. So I just make up my own. And then I change them along the way because, as one does. It's kind of like cooking. Add a pinch of that, add a bit of that. Anyway, we'll see that that's also probably not the best way to approach homebrewing. So a few of them have just been not nice as opposed to infected. But for those listening at home, if you've never homebrewed, it will probably help to go through a couple of the major steps of what a brew looks like, whether it's at home or whether it's in a brew house. Lisa, do you want to take us through some of the very high level steps of this?
Well, I think you did a good job with sort of explaining how, everything gets into essentially that, that extract, that version of things. And I will say, just as a sideline, I've gone through the same thing of, starting that way and then being like, wait, but I have no control over the thing. And then we went out and got our little grain mill, a little hand cranked thing, and all of that, because you start to say, which parts am I really interested in? And for me, it's the, it's the malt. And so that goes in, but again, you can really go down a rabbit hole with different yeasts and, all your different hops, all of that kind of thing. But yeah, broadly, like you say, you're effectively, making porridge. So you're making wort. So you're getting all of those sugars out of the, out of your grain by boiling it, but not so much. And then it's really just figuring out like, when's the right time to cool that down? When does it need to go and ferment? How long for? What kind of yeast are you putting in? And when? Because is it something you're doing once? Is it something you're doing multiple times? And again, you can get really, really creative, I guess, with how you're doing that. And I kind of have the same thing. And I think Christina's point too, where I'll start to be like, but historically, we might not have even bothered with X or Y, or maybe we did Y 4 times. Like if you're looking at like a step mash or, that kind of thing. And I know I'm getting like slightly off the topic there, but I do think like, basically, you're making your water hot, you've got your grain in there, you're fermenting it, you're adding, hops if that's what you want to do, or other things if that's what you want to do. And then boom, you're bottling it or you're kegging it or whatever. And I think the one thing too, like, at least in my experience, when it comes to whether or not you pour it down the drain, even sometimes if it's good, you might just have so much of it that you can't get people to drink it, and even if it's good. So it's like,
this is not a problem I've ever faced.
No. Just be friends with the beer ladies and you will not have
that may be it. Yeah, it's just a matter of transporting it from place to place, probably more than anything else. But yeah, I've had some drain pours.
When I brew, you can't actually stop me and my husband from drinking the brews, and they disappear way quicker than what the effort it took to get them, they would tell you.
See, I think I get bored with my own stuff, and then I'm like, same thing. Like, I'm like, oh, but I want to try something else. So, good intentions, and then I get distracted. So.
No, see, I can't tend to keep bottles for any length of time. And when you're a home brewer, like it almost helps to try and get a little bit of a rhythm going in terms of when you brew, and deciding on what to brew based on either the time of year or the recipe that you're looking at, whether it's your own or whether it's taken from a book or somewhere else. Because something, let's say, like this barley wine that I've been drinking needs a lot of aging time.
Yeah.
And you can't be making a barley wine expecting to drink it 2, 3, 4 weeks later,
right? And
then drinking that. You're not going to drink it the way that you drink a pale ale or a dark mild, for instance, which is a really lovely, quickish turnaround brew, and it's easy enough to drink. It's low alcohol and it's perfect. But I can't seem to keep beers for long enough to actually build a schedule. And also to age things. Like, it's a hell of a hard for me to keep beer for more than 6 weeks, which is a little bit of a downside, a little bit of a detriment to my own to my own tasting.
Well, although now that I'm thinking about it more, you're saying sort of what are the steps? I've realized I didn't start with sanitation, which should have been step one. Like if I'm judging a competition, it's that's always in my mind is, did they do their sanitation correctly, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's also because 9 times out of 10, if something's gone wrong, it's either temperature or sanitation. So it is really important to stay on top of that. But even when you stay on top of it, things can go wrong. There's just random chance too. So it's not simple.
Yeah, they can.
It's not. And the equipment to start off with, like, I think if people are first time homebrewers, they're not going to start off with a grain fodder. Like we started off with a big, massive saucepan. that we still use to boil our
Yeah.
Christmas ham, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I cook all of mine are stovetop brews because,
Yeah,
well, for historical reasons, a lot of people would have just been cooking in their kitchen.
definitely.
So, I don't have, the €1 million funds to make a medieval brew house or whatever, but, I try to use closer to what could have been possible.
Mm. And it's a really good point, because I think that there's a lot of people that are very intimidated by starting any homebrew project. So I think a lot of people would like to brew because they'd like to at least know what it's like to make beer with their own hands and their own ingredients, but it can be quite intimidating. So let's talk about just the very basics of how might you set yourself up for, a very basic system, because you don't need fancy equipment like a grandfather. The basics of what you need, in my opinion, but everybody chime in with yours. You need, let's call it a big pot. I'm talking about a 20-liter, like a stock pot. Now that can be quite tricky, actually. So for people who are on, those kind of stovetops that have the plates instead of gas, that's really hard. If you've got a really big pot, because it doesn't exactly fit like properly. So a lot of people do invest, if they've got a big pot, they invest in a small like gas cooker that the pot can go onto. But if you've got a gas stovetop, you can put any size pot on one of your plates, it'll be fine. The next sort of thing that you will need is, for your first step, which is mashing, and that's putting the grains into your pot with some water, you will need, just to make your life easier, some kind of sock or stocking. You can get everything that I'm talking about now at a homebrew store, but you'll need this because the step after mashing is called sparging. And sparging is when you take the grains out of the pot, and it's a lot easier to do if you've got something to hold them.
Yeah, and some of the brew and bag kits
logistical
are
thing.
really good for this. Like it comes with it, and it's a little bit of a step up from just, the extract, but you've got your sort of muslin bag there already, and that's a really nice, I think, entree without having to invest too much.
Definitely.
Yeah. And like when I do my medieval brews, we don't sparge. So it depends on what you want to do as well.
There are also loads of home brewers who don't sparge anyway, whether they're on a grandfather or any other fancy kit. There's a lot of different beers that don't call for sparging. So instead, what it means is that you're adding the grains and the total volume of water to what your recipe calls for, as opposed to sort of half now, half during the sparge, which then boils off to become your final volume. So it means that in a 20-liter pot, you'll probably only get 5 liters of beer out of it, or 10 maybe, but you'll be adding almost up to the 20-liter mark of your initial water, but you never have to do both steps. So yes, that is definitely a way to do things. So you need a sock, you'll need crocodile clips or something to keep them on. And that's a bit of a pro tip, because those socks don't like to stay on. So do that. And then you need a nice paddle to stir your mash. And you're going to need some ingredients. So if you're going straight to all grain as opposed to the kits, you need things like hops, whichever hops you're choosing. You need some kind of brewing software, which might tell you whether it's your own recipe or whether it's somebody else's, but you might want to just put your ingredients and your quantities and everything into something like, well, the easiest one, I use actually the Grainfather software, which I find very good, but a lot of people use different kinds, and there are very easy, like to understand ones for beginners. They may not be the most accurate, but they're good to use. And then there's very weird, complicated ones that people have to get used to. The learning curve is a bit higher. Something like BrewSmith is slightly higher learning curve, but very accurate and very customizable. That being said, you'll need your basic ingredients. Malt, so that's your grains. If you are brewing at home and you don't have a malt miller or a crusher, as Lisa's got, you want to buy that pre-crushed. Side note though, when you buy it pre-crushed, it's got a limited shelf life. So make sure that you buy only what you need, as opposed to buying the things that you think you're going to brew for the next 6 months. So buy per brew almost, and buy no more than 2 weeks in advance, because otherwise it'll go stale.
That's
And I'm
Tandy's
sure
tips here. We're going to call them Tandy's tips. That's a good one.
Tandy's tips. And actually, Lisa and Christina will be able to tell you, but at homebrew competitions, one of the biggest faults, if not sanitation and temperature, is oxidization and staleness. And it's mostly stale Malt, you do get stale hops too. So hop storage is also very important. Freeze them, just freeze them.
Yeah, it's so much easier to look after them that way. I mean, as much as it's lovely to have, your whole pellet hops, like, or your whole flower hops, that's really for your commercial brewers, unless you have so much just in your garden. Great, then go for it. But if you don't have that, it's not going to stay fresh. Yeah.
No. And I've made that mistake before by keeping my hops in the fridge instead of the freezer. And it's a very common mistake. And look, you've got to be quite, I think, experienced, or the style has to lend itself to being able to pick up stale hops, but there is nothing like it. And you will taste it. Anything papery and oxidized is just gross in a competition.
Cardboard.
So, yeah, cardboardy.
Yep, the wet cardboard. No one wants that.
And it is common.
It is common, very, very common. So besides your ingredients, obviously your yeast, which is also a really important ingredient. And a lot of people, as Lisa said, you can go down whichever rabbit hole you want on whichever process or ingredient you want when it comes to homebrewing. A lot of people go down the yeast rabbit hole. Yeast storage is very important. My best estimate was to refrigerate yeast, not to freeze it. But I think that there is still some debate on that. It also depends on whether you're buying liquid yeast or dried yeast. I think with liquid and dried, I'm sure that the best one is to just refrigerate, but happy to be proven wrong.
Yeah, and it's about you making sure you're matching the yeast for what it is you're trying to do, because it's great to be creative, but sometimes you will get things that just do not go together. And this is, again, where you can talk to whoever is at your homebrew store, or someone who maybe is, part of your homebrew club, or even if you don't have that, just look online and you can get a sense of, will this work, will this not? And it's great to try and experiment, but, for example, some, we'll call them Belgian yeasts, for, even though that's too broad a category and I can get pedantic about that, but some of them just will not play nicely with certain hops, and it'll end up tasting like, it'll be very catty. Don't do it. So, but again, that goes back to sort of the stale hops idea as well. But once those come together, that's nobody wants that. I'll put it that way.
No. So yes, exactly. So pick your ingredients, whether it's, again, start from a recipe. Don't be like me, kids. Start from a recipe of things that actually work, because it's a really good way to learn.
Definitely.
Start from that. There's loads of good books that have got recipes, 1,001 beers that you must brew before you die. These kinds of books are actually really good, because they don't just teach you what's in these very well-known kind of styles or beers that we know and love. It teaches you about the processes involved, because as with anything, as with cooking, baking, brewing, it's not just about your ingredients, it's also about the method. And a lot of different beers have got a lot of different methods involved. Whether it's something that Lisa mentioned earlier, something like step mashing, which is bringing your mash temperature up by specific degrees of heat, and it's leaving them at certain steps, and that's really good for things like pilsners. It's also good for things like a Weiss beer, where you actually need to do a bit of a protein rest before bringing it up to its heat. But regardless, you'll find all of that. There's plenty of resources online. But if we're talking now about equipment, so besides your ingredients, which you can always get from a homebrew store, you need that like stovetop stock pot type thing with a paddle and a sock and clips. That's your cooking bit. You'll need another pot if you're not going to do no sparge. So if you're going to need to pour water over your grains to rinse them and get all the residual sugars out, which is normally step 2 of a brew, you'll need another pot to have hot water in with a jug, so that you can pour the sort of heated water onto your grains. So that's number 2. And then number 3, you'll need to cool it down. So if you're starting from absolute basics, what's helpful is a bathtub with lots of ice. If you don't have a bathtub, you could use literally a wheelie bin, or just like a really, really big bucket, but lots of ice to cool it down quickly. One of the steps within a home brew is to cool down your brew quite quickly. It prevents the formation of all kinds of off flavors. It also brings it to the best temperature for the yeast quickly, and you want to do that so that nothing funky grows. And then after that, you need a fermentation bucket. So that is a food grade plastic bucket, or a demijohn, which is glass. You also need a way to clean these things. So you need all of the right cleaning equipment for whichever one you've got. Sometimes glass and plastic can be treated differently, sometimes not. It's okay. You need to clean and you need to sterilize. Another big mistake I've seen in beginner homebrewers is thinking that that's the same process. It's not. So people think that the sterilizer actually cleans everything. It doesn't. You need to clean, rinse, then sterilize. A lot of sterilizers can be left on because they're food safe, which is handy. Thank goodness for that. But check your ingredients. You'll generally need both. So, and you'll need, with your either demijohn or your bucket, you'll need some kind of airlock, which basically prevents funkies from going in, but it allows the CO2 to escape. So think of it as a one-way valve. You normally filled it with water, or if you like me, a bit of like vodka or gin, something, strong alcohol to kill anything if it was on its way in and is fairly sanitary. And then you're going to need, if you're beginning your journey, you're going to need bottles. Now, don't simply be tempted to keep all the bottles that you've been drinking. And it's not because they're not good enough. They are. But bottles have got annoyingly different diameters on their necks. And because you're going to need caps for these bottles, you just need to make sure, if you're going to be reusing bottles, make sure that they've got the same diameter of neck as the caps that you're buying, because I've made that mistake before too. Trying to keep bottles and thinking that they're going to fit my caps. No, they don't. You're going to need that. You'll need a way to carbonate your beer. So once it's fermented, normally that takes about 2 weeks. It depends on the style though. You want to then clean and sanitize your bottles, get your beer in, normally with a little bit of extra sugar or something just to reactivate any residual yeast, and that carbonates in the bottle. And you need something to be able to cap it. So if you're using straight kind of crown caps like these ones, if you're watching YouTube, this is a crown cap. You need a bit of a machine. It's not a machine, it's just a little clamp almost
Little clamp,
to
yeah.
cap them. Yeah. And they don't run too expensive either, so they're not difficult to get. You need one of those. Or if you are trying to be smart and using things like those bottles that have already got the cap on them, be very careful because they get very dirty. But you can use them, but be very careful with those. So you need a capper, you need bottles, and you'll need a way to clean these bottles. So a brush normally is the first thing, plus again your chemicals. That's the same for all of your stuff. And then you leave those to sit for another, let's say 2 to 3 weeks, again depending on the style, to carbonate in generally a warm-ish area. So there are parts of your house that are good for home brewing and parts that aren't. You don't want things to be too hot. I've got a story for that later. But you don't want things to be too cold, because when you are, depending on the style again, different yeasts need different temperatures in order to actually work. And that goes for primary fermentation, as well as conditioning or bottle fermentation. You don't want it to be in the coldest part of your house, if that part of your house is 8 degrees, because man, yeast will just go straight to sleep, just like everybody. In an air-conned hotel room, you go straight to sleep. Same thing with yeast. So that's basically what you need if you're really starting from the beginning.
I'm going to add that a thermometer.
Yes.
Digital is easier. I don't know. And also, what's it called? A hydrometer to measure your specific gravity as well.
Good shot.
And if this is all very intimidating, which it can sound incredibly intimidating, there's lots of homebrew stores online in Ireland that you can just kind of get a basic kit. So you don't have to, unless you want to get all the equipment separately, which knock yourself out if that's what you want to do. But I have just a stovetop kit from Get Her Brewed. I order most of my stuff from Get Her Brewed. I really like them. Their delivery is so fast. I've ordered 2 different stovetop kits there because I was using a glass bottle and I hate it. So, but that's just personal preference. Other people like them. I don't like it. Not for me. So I just went with a plastic bucket this time and I'm much happier with that. But it comes with a lot of that equipment. So the first one I got the capper, I got bottle caps, I got like the big glass thing, the funnel to get from one direction to the other. Like it came with a lot of different stuff, and it wasn't that expensive. Now they have like more advanced ones, and it'll go up and up and up, but you don't, if you are intimidated when you're thinking about all this, there are absolutely places where you can just be like, okay, just send me the stuff, and they'll send you everything with instructions on how to use it as well. So that's what I do, and I do recommend that.
Yeah, absolutely.
They will normally have everything in there, and that's all good homebrew shops. So Get a Brewed is one of them that here in Ireland, I use Get a Brewed mostly. There's also the Homebrew shop, which is very good. They also have these kinds of things, beginner's starter kit, and they've got everything. And everybody, all of these companies deliver, and they do all the things. So it's always a nice thing. And I'm sure if you're in the States, or if you're in Canada or India or Australia, wherever you are, there are homebrew shops that will put together these packages for you. But that's the rundown of kind of what you need. The hydrometer, by the way, and a thermometer are good calls, because part of good homebrewing and good brewing in general is measuring. So that's your data. So if you measure where your beer started out, and then you measure it every few days while it's fermenting, you will know when it's fermented out. But you don't really know when it's fermented out unless you have that starting point. A lot of the brewing software will give you estimates, but that's not good enough if you're trying to bottle your beer. And a lot of people make the mistake of not measuring things like their original gravity and their final gravity and all the things. You don't have to measure everything, but measure those, because what happens, and this is probably the most common homebrew fail story in the world, what happens is if you leave too much sugar after that primary fermentation and you bottle it, by adding more sugar to get it fermenting and carbonating in the bottle, you get what is bottle bombs. And bottle bombs are the effective horror story of all beer homebrewing. It's almost the only way that homebrewing beer is going to actually, or could actually, harm you or your house. And what it does is it just puts too much pressure in the bottle, because there's too much activity from the yeast, and then the bottle explodes. It doesn't matter that it's glass, it explodes. And there's lots of people that have had that happen to them.
Yeah, that's one of those anecdotes that my dad used to tell me, the story of even when they were making soda at home in the 1930s. So this is a very long time ago, sort of small town America. It's in a cellar, all of these things, but they're making their sarsaparilla soda, and they let children do whatever back then, but they'd done all the things. They'd put way too much sugar in, clearly, and he would tell this story again and again, and they started hearing just sounds from below when they're kind of in their living room, and they looked down in the cellar and just saw bottle after bottle and cap after cap just flying everywhere. So and that's again, making something not alcoholic, you kind of add another degree of difficulty. So you don't want to be there when you've got those literal glass flying everywhere. It's definitely not it's suboptimal. Don't do it. So one thing I wanted to add too is again, it's so important to just sort of check at your local homebrew store, because it doesn't have to be complicated. They can walk you through what you need for your setup and just to get started. But one of the things that struck me when we were first getting started, this is close to 20 years ago now, like how much of this stuff is really not like, it's basic stuff. It's plastic buckets effectively, and some, like some glass jars and funnels, and it's not stuff that you couldn't necessarily source other places, but it's nice that the homebrew folks have figured that all out for you. And so you don't have to go hunting around. Now, that said, as you get better at it and you get more sophisticated, then you can also start saying, oh, I want this specific yeast from this person who supplies X or Y, but you don't have to do that starting out. You let them do that legwork for you until you really know kind of what you're doing. And if you need to hunt down those other things, because I think it can be a surprise initially to spend a bunch of money and get all your kit, arrives in your, kind of in your cardboard box, and you're like, it's a plastic bucket. Okay. But it's very normal stuff. So don't freak out.
Although it is really funny, because it's one of the running jokes in the homebrew community. It's like, you think you start homebrewing to save money, as in inverted commas or air quotes. Right. You really don't save money. You do, like actually in the long run, you do. If all you're going to drink is your homebrew, or if you're going to homebrew enough that you've got your regular drinking days kind of sorted, it really can save you a lot of money. But don't get into it if you think it's just going to be that. because you will have a very unpleasant surprise ahead of you. It's one of these hobbies that can get very expensive very quickly. And the initial outlay, look, it may be 100 or 150 euros initially per brew. Again, it depends on what you're going to be brewing. And look, I can only talk in euros at the moment and in Ireland at the moment, but I spend on average 20 to 25 euros on a brew, and that's ingredients and shipping and all of the things. But I've been staying away from hoppy beers and hoppy brews because I didn't have, I wasn't super confident about whether I could keep the hop flavors and aromas while bottle conditioning as opposed to kegging. Now, kegging is obviously one way to level up your home brewing. If you're going to do, if you're going to do one thing, first do temperature control. If you're going to start spending more money after a basic kit, then do kegging. I would do temperature before kegging, but that's just me.
And how would you do temperature control, Tandy? Would you just get like a lagging jacket, or would you go more upmarket?
It depends on what your problem is that you need to solve. So the problem that I have is that I can't get my beers cool enough. If I wanted to do something like a lager, I can't get my beers cool enough. While my house is actually cold, it still sits at 14 odd degrees in the middle of winter, and that's not quite cold enough for a lager. So to cool things down, you'd need something like a fridge or a freezer that's been converted to be able to be temperature variable. And there are ways to kind of hack that. It's a DIY job. It's a reason that brewing is very much shares a Venn diagram section with people who like to do things themselves and build stuff, and engineers, especially software engineers. But so it's a bit of a DIY job where you get a temperature controller and you get a monitor for inside, and it plugs into different powers. So that's the one thing, and that solves kind of two problems. The one is heating and the other one is cooling. So if you needed your beers for the yeast that you've got or for the style that you're trying to brew to be warmer, you could get something quite simple, like a jacket, or put it into a bit of a polystyrene box because it just keeps heat a little bit better. Insulating for heat is a lot easier than cooling things down. But I think that there's something that people don't really talk about in home brewing, and it's not just fermentation temperature. Fermentation temperature is enormously important, especially depending on which style you brew, but it's also the conditioning and storage temperature that you need to take account of. So for me, if you're going to really do temperature control properly, you actually need to have two different things. One is the place where you keep your kegs or your bottles, if you're going to be serving them, at the right kind of temperature that conditions them and that you can keep them for a long time. Now, what I've seen with my own brews, because I don't have good temperature control at the moment, is that they get too warm for a long time. So it's absolutely not the reason that I drink my beers too quickly, but they can't stay in my they can't stay in my kitchen cupboard for 6 months and without any effects on them. To condition and keep beers for a good long time, you need them to be cold, like 2, 4, 6 degrees. You need them to be at that temperature. And that's also good for kegs. Whether it's at 12 degrees or 8 degrees, these are good cold temperatures. So that's a serving, let's say, cooling thing. And then the other one is fermentation. So unless you're brewing exactly one beer at a time for many weeks at a time, you might need even more than one kind of solution for your different fermentations. Some need warmer stuff. If you're brewing with a Kveik yeast, for instance, you need to be at 36, 38 degrees Celsius. That is hot.
Yeah.
With any temperature, whether it's hot, mild or warm or cold, what you really need is consistent temperature.
Yeah.
So you could use a fridge for that with a temperature controller, or you could use all these very smart fermenters that have got glycol chillers attached and heating attached to them. You could use very basic setup or very expensive, like fancy setup. But what you're looking for is something that is consistent, that you can control, and that you can use for different kinds of brews. Now, that's an expensive rabbit hole to go down, but I would go down that before I went back to kegging, even though kegging is so much easier and so much better. You don't have to clean 40 bottles every time you brew. The problem is that I would already need something to store the keg, keep it at temperature before serving it. And so then I may as well invest in two things. So I'd still rather bottle after having temperature control for fermentation.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point too about the storage versus your temperature when you're actually brewing, because it's easy to be like, oh, I'm going to get a wort chiller. This is going to be great. Yes, that solves that problem. But then you still have to, keep it after that. And again, like it can sound like, oh, there's a lot of great kit that will solve this problem. But the more you dig into it, it's like, oh, okay, but then it may create another problem down the line. So think about what you really need. It doesn't mean don't buy these things. It's just try to think about what you're trying to do. And is it going to be worth getting the cool piece of kit that maybe you use once or twice and then say, oh, is this really going to be something I use in the long run? And I think that's the other reason that you do see people within the homebrew community say, does anyone want this? I don't think I need this now. So people will trade kit around and let you borrow things. So I think that's also, important pro tip. Definitely share.
Definitely.
And I think sometimes it's just like finding out what's the temperature in my shed, or what if I decide to not turn on the rad in this room, so that the temperature isn't nice and cool, and then it comes on for 2 hours and my temperature shoots up, because you don't want the little temperature spikes, you just want a constant.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And if this all sounds incredibly complicated, incredibly intense, may I introduce you to historical brewing?
Where the turnaround is quick and the sanitation is dodgy.
Yes. Now, that being said, there are some projects where they're literally building the brew houses that like would have been, and they're using like sundials and hourglasses that are recreated from what they would have been at the time. And we definitely need to get some of those people on the podcast. So that will happen in the future. But that is not what I do. So I should say historical-ish recipes, something that's just a bit of fun. I am in no way walking around here saying it's exactly what it would have been like in the time, but I was joking when I said about the loophole, but I'm actually kind of not, because I don't sanitize as such. So I clean and then I'll add boiling water, but I'm not going to use any chemicals that wouldn't have been available for reasons. Also lazy, but it's a lot less steps. So for me, depending on what recipe and who I'm brewing after, and I have the recipes that I've done on my website, not always sparging, for example. There's definitely arguments to be made about filtering and not filtering the malt out. There are definitely people that have made arguments about, fermenting on grain, which is a whole another thing, but they can be a lot less labor intensive in the long run. So some of them are quite more complicated when you're doing the mash in. So you're adding water at this time and 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 this. It's a lot. So there's a lot of steps, but then that's it. You're not necessarily adding hops. So for a lot of medieval ales, you aren't necessarily adding any herbs, or you're doing it later in sort of like a cheesecloth bag and you're just letting it hang there. So there's a lot less intensity there. And for some of them, the turnaround is a week or less. So you're not fermenting them for ages. But then again, these aren't necessarily ales or beers that are going to be something that you're going to make a lot of. It's not necessarily something that you want to drink constantly. Some of them are really low ABV. So like that's things to keep in mind, but they're really fun to make. I would love to see more people recreate kind of this stuff, and we can talk about it and compare notes and see what we think about these kind of things. I just think it would be really fun to do. So just like I've made a medieval English small ale, a Sumerian ale, working on Irish medieval ale, like these sorts of things. And it's just kind of fun way to, I don't know, meet people in the past, like it just to kind of share that experience maybe. And like, I'm very clear they're historical-ish because I don't have, the same equipment. I'm not doing it over a fire, for example, like there's definitely things that aren't precisely, I'm using my stovetop, so I'm definitely cheating. But it's just a bit of fun. And I do recommend that if you just want to try something that's really not quite as intense as some of the other beers that you can make. It's just, it's fun.
It sounds fun. I think that to me, even though the process doesn't sound as intimidating, it sounds more intimidating to me to try and find the recipe or how it might be historically accurate. Like that to me sounds like the work of it.
Yeah. I should probably, that's my job. So I guess like that's the fun stuff for me. But like I also, it's an experiment. So like it doesn't have to be perfect. Like for me and my brain, it's like, oh, I like this person's recipe. This is something that they've tried. Let me like look at what I have. Okay, maybe that's similar. Let's just try it and see where we go. When I recreate these historical beers and make these historical-ish recipes, it's fun. Like this is fun for me. If I was going to write an academic paper, I wouldn't be doing this. I would have to have different equipment. It would be a whole nother ballgame. This is just play. This is just for fun. This is not in the realm of what some academic, like I was saying, that, they're recreating the brew house. This is not in the same realm of that. This is, hey, what can I do in my kitchen to get pretty close to this? And that's all it is. And there's a lot of really amazing resources out there that have these, ale recipes or braggot recipes from the past that you can access. And then we can just look at like the Priory, Christchurch Cathedral, when it was a priory, we have account rolls. So that's what I've used to make the grain bill for my medieval Irish ale. And then I've looked at medical texts and the archaeobotanical evidence to see like what herbs were here. So yeah, okay, maybe that part's intense a little bit, maybe.
because this is a bit of a choose your own adventure, and I think that it can be intimidating anyway, whether you're homebrewing to try and make beer that's really drinkable, or whether you're trying to make beer that you can enter into a competition, or whether you're trying to replicate something historical or get close to it. It's all going to be experimentation. You're not going to make excellent beer every single time. You can dial in your processes, and you can really, if you're quite a methodical person. Is that the right word? Yes.
Yeah.
If you're quite meticulous and methodical, this is a hobby that you could really get into, because homebrewing, whether it was medieval and it was, very much done in the kitchen and everybody kind of did it, it still requires steps and processes and things that you can kind of dial in and tune up and really perfect. But it is an experiment, and you know what? It's only beer. It's okay. Like,
yeah,
relax. Yeah,
it's for me, it's fun. Like it's just a fun thing to do. I just thoroughly enjoy it. If I started obsessing over a lot of the details, I don't think I would have as much fun anymore. So for me, when I'm recreating these historical ales, it's very much historical-ish, and just a bit of fun that I'm just trying out for funsies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, there are resources out there. Lots of stuff is published already, and in very accessible texts. They're not all hidden away in academic papers. A lot of things are just, recipe books. They are out there. And again, your homebrew store can direct you to some of these, or we can let you know like some of our own favorites. But they're not so hard to find that you'd have to go hunting for them. Some of them are, absolutely, but there's a lot that is accessible that you can just get in there and start tinkering around with.
Absolutely.
One thing that we haven't covered yet, and I know we did an episode last season on water 101 with our good friend Chelsea. Hi.
Hi, Chelsea.
Water we haven't spoken about. And
right.
It's like, do you use tap water? Do you use bottled water when you're starting out? Because you're not going to invest in an ion exchange or anything like that from the get-go.
Oh, man,
yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, and what do you want to make? And do you have to Burtonize your water, which is just one of my favorite words.
Burtonize.
And again, people will geek out about that. Yeah, Burtonize. So yeah, it's effectively making your water as if it is like the water from Burton-on-Trent. So it's, again, are you adding salt? Are you taking away salt? Like, so many things you could do. And I will say, I don't think I've ever met a home brewer who has not at some point had their water analyzed just to see what's in their tap water. Is it something you can, do X or Y with? And it can make a big difference. And especially here in Ireland, a lot of people have very hard water, or depending, you know, other very soft water too. So that's something you definitely need to consider when, you know, thinking about what is something I can brew well with, you know, the resources at hand. And I think too, like you were saying, Christina, that can sound like it's really scary and intimidating because you have to start doing chemistry. And I was not good at that at school, but for some reason, maybe because it's more practical, I'm like, oh, I can figure this out though. So yeah, but it's a good question.
I still find water the most terrifying part of brewing. It's the thing that intimidates me the most. But here's some advice that I got, and I think it's stood me in good stead. If you like the taste of your tap water, your drinking water, you will likely like the taste of your beer. Now, you may not get the hops to stay in your beer, because a common complaint here, especially in, let's call it South Dublin, where I am, is that hoppy beers just don't work. The hops just like disappear in the beer. And it's because it's not hard enough. It's quite soft water. So if you want to not do anything to your water, that's fine. But you will find which styles work and which ones don't. And you can choose to brew things that work with what you've got, or you can brew things, you can brew what you want, but then you'll have to change some variable. Okay. So figure out which kind of a brewer you are. I'm more of the brew with what I've got for now. So I don't tend to brew overly hopped overly hopped beers. Firstly, I don't really want to waste the money. Hops are super expensive, especially if I'm bottle conditioning, and bottle conditioning is just not the best for hoppy beers. So I tend to stick to things like a Weiss beer, or I've brewed a dark mild before, which was really interesting. I've made some good stouts. I've made, you know, things that are slightly more balanced or slightly more malty for my kind of water right now. And because I bottle condition, they work. That being said, again, it's only beer. If you wanted to start small, start with, I don't know, 5 liters of every kind of thing that you're trying to do, and see which ones work with your water. If there's something in your water that you don't like the taste of, without filtering it at all, then figure that thing out. And go back and listen to our water episode, because at the very end, there was a bit of advice that I got from a very, very well accomplished home brewer. And it's just about, you know, which salts and things to add for which kind of beer you're trying to look for. Could probably pull it up, but maybe we'll put it into the show notes below, just as a guide. But yeah, it's just brew what you want. It's only beer. It's an experiment. It's not a competition. If you like the beer, then that's also fine. Just don't use brewer's yeast. Don't use that. That's not for beer. It's for bread. Ish.
Yeah, you'll get your actual yeast at the homebrew store. Yeah.
Yes.
Which will not be called brewer's yeast, so that can be confusing. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But water is one of those rabbit holes that you can go. You could absolutely go down that one. When I first started brewing, I was more interested in malts and figuring out the play between malts. And then it was kind of hops. And I was like, oh, what do I do with all these different hops? And figuring out processes in which to get the best hop flavors. But that worked well when I was kegging. Because when you keg, you don't have this sort of natural fermentation happening in the bottle to carbonate it. So when that happens, it eats at your hop oils and your hop flavors. And so you get a much pared down version of whatever hops you've got if you're bottle conditioning, which is why I've stayed away from it here. But if you're kegging and you force carbonating, easy peasy, do what you want. So what gotchas should homebrewers be looking at then before they enter their beers into competitions? So beer judges, looking at you.
I'll start with
yeah.
one thing that I get slightly fussy about. And just a side note, I discovered, because Facebook decided to tell me, that it's 15 years ago I took the BJCP exam initially. So I've been doing that a long time, apparently.
Congratulations.
Yeah, so there you go. But
really
I think
good.
we touched on it a little bit before, but I'll bring it back up, is the bit about your record keeping and, you know, measuring and keeping stock of your original gravity and what you've put in it. I think if you're going to enter something into a competition, first of all, it just behooves you to be taking notes and knowing what worked, what didn't, so you can build on your own process. But when you are entering it into a competition, and if you don't really know what you've ended up with, whether it's because you've not taken your notes throughout or because you're just kind of guessing, and sometimes it can be wrong just no matter what, but that helps so much to make sure you're entering things into the right category, or at least gets you more kind of in the ballpark. So if I'm looking at like, sheets of saying this should be this, and I'm like, oh no, this says it should be a 4%, porter or whatever. And I taste it, I'm like, oh, something happened here. And this is clearly much stronger, much, much more alcoholic, that kind of thing. I think maybe that, instead of going back to those sort of obvious technical faults, which might have been around, again, sanitation or heat. In that case, I'd be something like something's gone wrong here with some sugar, or something didn't ferment right, or fermented in a crazy way. But, I think that record keeping, that kind of discipline there can help make sure you're not making some of those mistakes. And also, if, again, because you're going to hopefully taste it before you're entering something into the competition, hopefully you're going to be like, wait, I should be getting this, but I'm tasting that. Like, hopefully that'll help you kind of be like, Now, that said, I've then seen people go and revise, be like, yes, this is actually this. I'm like, great. If that's what it ended up as, sure. Why not? All good, but just try to be in the right category. Yeah.
That was the one
add to
thing.
that.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the biggest issues I come across.
Make sure you're into the right category. And that's not, it doesn't come from which grains and amounts and hops you use. It actually comes from tasting the beer, because you can get penalized or kicked out if you make the best session IPA you've ever made in your whole life. But if you've entered it into an IPA category, it's not gonna score. Exactly. It just won't score. So
no, we're not allowed to. We can't.
No.
And it's frustrating. And I've definitely written in feedback before, this is a really good beer.
Definitely.
But it's not this, category. And if you put it in this one, I would have given you really high marks, but I can't grade you as that. I have to grade you in the category in which you entered, which means you might get docked a lot of points in a BJCP homebrew competition simply because we're not allowed to give you those points. And, and then we'll write in the notes about that. But that's one thing to really watch out for. I cannot agree with Lisa more than this one.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that also means, by extension, that you should be planning your brews. If you know that there's a competition coming up, plan it so that you've got plenty of time to actually taste your beer before entering it into the competition. Because a lot of competitions, when you enter, your beer's probably still fermenting. See if you can enter without entering the category, or see if you can change it, because it is a thing. I think because it's a hobby, guys, I think people are brewing right until the minute that it needs to get sent off, and that's fair enough. I've been there, I've done this, but gosh, brew first, enter later. Do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, things will happen that may not be, that'll be out of your control, like the temperature while you're sending your things over, or what happens when they get stored somewhere while you're, waiting for that competition to happen. That's not always great. So there's all those variables that you can't control, but control what you can. It really does make a difference. And I think even if it's a recipe you've made again and again really successfully, just taste it and see, is it still landing where it should? Because again, sometimes things just happen. I do have one thing that I like to call sort of accidental cool ship syndrome. And you don't want that. It's where you suddenly, a rogue yeast has gotten in somewhere, you don't know how. And again, it's something that may have worked again and again, but for whatever reason, something blew in, the window was open, you can have it all go horribly wrong. So just taste it, make sure it's still the right thing. And again, sometimes the wrong thing can happen and it turns into a great beer, but maybe you don't want to then enter it into a competition. You want to figure out, ooh, what happened here? Is this, do I want to replicate this? Did I mean to do this without knowing it? So, it doesn't have to be competitive. It can just be creative. So,
and equally on that, I just want to say, it's actually totally fine to enter a beer in a competition isn't that good, because you want the good feedback.
You want feedback.
If you're a BJCP beer judge, you should be filling out that whole sheet from top to bottom. There shouldn't be blank lines. They should be giving you in incredible detail what went wrong, if something went wrong, what to fix, how to fix it, where in the brewing process it was fixed. That's the feedback that you should be getting.
Definitely.
If you're not getting that, you should complain about it, because that's what you should be getting. And so it is completely encouraged by me to enter a beer that you're like, something's not right here.
Yeah, totally.
You know, maybe I just want some feedback on this. And I obviously don't even need to enter a competition to do that, but like it really does help to get all that written feedback on all the different portions. And if you're not familiar with BJCP judging, we did a episode on that, so I recommend listening to that. But overview is you look at the beer from aroma, appearance, flavor, mouthfeel,
overall,
all
yeah.
impressions,
Yeah, all the
blah
things,
blah blah
yeah.
blah. Anyway, the point is that there's lots of different categories that the judge will be considering, and then they'll also mention off flavors and all these other things. So you should be getting lots of detailed feedback. So if you want to progress in your brewing journey and you're a little intimidated by these competitions, it's okay, and it's encouraged that you should enter beers that you're not completely confident with, so that way you can get more confident.
Totally.
So I really encourage you to enter the competitions. If you're like, oh, I just don't know what, it's meh. I want it to be good, but it's meh, and just to see what kind of feedback that you get and see if that's something that you can apply. And that's what I would recommend.
Yes, I want to agree with that, although maybe it just combines both points. But if you're opening up your bottle and it's just kind of overflowing and it's a real kind of spiller, whatever the case is, don't enter it, because you know what's wrong. It's sanitation. Fix that first, and then go to your homebrew club. Please join a homebrew club. Homebrew clubs are so good, because in general, people meet, whether it's once a month or once every 2 months. You taste each other's beers, and look, there may not be BJCP judges all the time, but you'll bet that there will be BJCP judges there who can give you very pinpointed and yet casual feedback on your beer. So if you've got a gusher, it's generally an infection. That generally comes down to sanitization, cleaning. But if it's, as Christina says, if it's just not quite delivering on what you aimed for, a competition is a great way to get feedback, because it'll come down to weird things like your water, your fermentation temperature, maybe, although that's a fairly easy one to kind of identify. But water, freshness of ingredients, these kinds of things will come up in your feedback, and it's very useful.
Here.
Yeah. Well, friends, I did ask around. I asked around on Twitter, and I asked around in one of the homebrew chats that I'm in, and I did ask for some stories, just in case we didn't share enough, of what can go wrong and what can go right in homebrew. Although I will give a shout out to Rossa, and I'll give a shout out to Kev from Third Barrel. Even though their stories were quite similar, I thought I'd mention them anyway. But both of these were just basically bottle bombs. So remember what we were talking about, whether you're either bottling or it's your primary fermentation, this is just one of these things where learning very early on how volatile bottles can be is a good lesson. Because they will explode if there's too much sugar left in there, or if there's an infection that can also sometimes do mad things. So the moral of the story is check your sanitation, make sure that things are stupid clean, and make sure that your things have fermented out before bottling, if you're bottling. I've never heard of a keg exploding, but I do believe it's possible, so be careful. But yeah, these two stories that I got, as well as a few more that I got from the Capital Homebrewers WhatsApp group, were mostly about bottle bombs. So it's clearly the thing that most people wanted to impress upon new brewers. So yeah, watch out for bottle bombs. Store things, if you can, away from important or valuable stuff. So I did recently have a bottle bomb, the first time ever in my homebrewing career, except that it wasn't beer, it was tepache, which is a very weird one. It's got so little alcohol that you wouldn't even believe that it would ferment. But anyway, it did. But it was in the box that I built for like conditioning and fermenting beers. So it was all kind of contained, thank goodness. There was 2 or 3 like wine bottle sizes that just went ballistic after I corked them. A couple of days later, it was clearly too warm in there and there had too much activity going on. We heard this massive sound and I thought, who the hell is setting off fireworks at like 6 in the morning? No, it was my bottles. They were going mad in the box. And so I opened the lid a little bit scared, to see what the hell is going on in there. And there was one that was still, put together. And I was like, oh shit, can't deal with this thing. Anyway, my husband dealt with that. Thank goodness. He had to like pop it in the shower just in case it, went mad, which it did because it gushed everywhere and it was all the things. But anyway, I don't recommend also making tepache and then trying to add more honey to make it even more fizzy. Doesn't need it. So, so those are most of the horror stories from homebrewers are around bottle bombs. So be careful of those. Although I've been brewing for, I don't know, close on 10 years, and that was the first time it ever happened, and it wasn't beer. So, yeah. Any parting thoughts, friends? Otherwise, we are going to start wrapping up here.
Just emphasize again, check your temperature, check your sanitation. We're going to keep saying it. It's really, I don't want to say it's as simple as that, but I feel like those are your two biggest hurdles. If you've got those, you're good, almost regardless of what you're making.
Yep. And watch those categories that you're entering in the competition.
Yeah, very, very good. And I will say that if you are in Ireland and you're looking to join a homebrew club, contact me on Twitter or on Instagram, because I'm part of the homebrew club and I can point you in the right direction to the one that's closest to you. As well as if you're in South Africa, on the off chance that you're listening to this, because I can point you to the right clubs there too. Can't help you with anywhere else in the world, I'm afraid, but you never know. Very quick reminder, we are at Beer Ladies Pod everywhere on the internet pretty much, and you can buy some merch, you can buy us a beer, you can share this episode with a friend, watch us on YouTube, do all the things. We love it when you engage with us, especially on Twitter and Instagram. It's really fun to see what you all think about our episodes and how they move you or touch you in whatever ways. So so thank you, Katie, Lisa, Christina, thank you so much for bringing your stories, and everybody listening at home, we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.